A rare march against the monarchy in Thailand and a demand for political reform. The protests have been the biggest in years. So what can the government do to quell this growing anger? And what does this mean for Thailand's king? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hala Mohiuddin. A wave of protests has gripped Thailand since February. It's been led by the young, mostly first-time voters, who say they want to modernise the monarchy. Over the weekend, tens of thousands occupied a park used for royal ceremonies, and they cemented a plaque near the Grand Palace. It expresses what they say is the people's will. The protesters also handed over a letter with their demands to the royal guards. Well, these demands include the removal of Prime Minister Prayuth Chanocha. He's a former army general who came to power in a coup in 2014 and won a disputed election last year. They also want Parliament dissolved and new elections to be held. They're demanding the constitution, which was drafted by the military, be rewritten. Also included in this charter is an end to the intimidation of dissidents. And a very sensitive demand that has long been unthinkable in Thailand, reform of the monarchy. The Thai king is widely revered, and criticising him can carry a prison sentence of up to 15 years.
I think the 10 demands is heading towards a clear direction. It's about being able to speak about things that he don't dare to talk about. A true democracy means that no power alone could stay above us. We can't be afraid. If we are afraid, this means we are suppressed by some sort of power.
These demands do not propose to get rid of the monarchy. They're proposals with good intentions to make the institution of the monarchy remain graciously above the people under democratic rule.
The installation of the plaque is for everyone to be aware that we want to have a true democracy given back to us, to reform the monarchy and truly keep the institution under a democratic constitution.
Well, more protests are due later this week, and a nationwide general strike is due to be held in October. Wayne Hay has more from outside the Grand Palace in Bangkok.
Well, the significance, first of all, is the location where the protest was held. Tens of thousands of people turning out on Saturday, and where this plaque has been placed, Sanam Lawang, which is the park that you mentioned just across the road from the Grand Palace. It's a historic site. It's been the scene of many royal ceremonies for centuries, and it used to be a place that was open to the general public to use during the day as well. But in recent years, that's not been the case. It's been off limits to the public. So the protest leaders made it clear that that was one of their targets. They wanted to retake this park for the people, and that's exactly what they did. And in the early hours of Sunday morning, they dug up a section of the concrete in the park and placed this plaque into that area. Now, the significance of the plaque itself is that it commemorates the 1932 revolution that turned Thailand from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional one. So the plaque says that Thailand is for the people, not just for the king. 3 years ago, an official plaque in another location nearby mysteriously disappeared overnight. So that was seen by many, certainly the protesters here, and as another sign that the king was strengthening his power and perhaps turning Thailand back into an absolute monarchy again.
Well, let's bring in our guests, all of whom are joining us from Bangkok. First up, we have Parit Wacharasin, the founder of the Progressive Constitution Group and a former politician. And from Bangkok, Jade Dovanovic is the chairman of the Faculty of Law at the College of Asian Scholars. Thank you both for joining us here on Inside Story. First up, if you could explain to me, what are the main demands of the protesters? What are driving them? Because there seem to be a couple of competing narratives. Parit, let me start with you. What do you think is driving these protesters?
Sure. I think the first thing we need to understand is that yesterday is not just a solitary event or solitary protest, but it's one of a series of protests that have been staged over the past 2 or 3 months. and that it's not all been organized by one single group, but each time it's organized by a different group. So it's natural that with this decentralized nature of the way the protests have happened, that the demands and the interests of each group may differ slightly. But I think one common ground that we are seeing and we are hearing from all the protests that we've seen in the past is their wish to see Thailand become a full democracy, or what they believe should be a full democracy under the principles of constitutional monarchy, which they feel that with the current constitution, with the current political climate, Thailand falls short of that.
Okay, Jade, I understand that you were an advisor when the current constitution was being drafted. How do you see these protests? What do you think is driving these protests right now? And do you recognise anything in the current constitution that you think perhaps needs to be updated or amended?
I used to understand the same as Prayuth has just said, that they were wanting true democracy and they want the constitutional monarchy as well as democracy with the king as head of state under the constitution. I think that was I used to understand. But from yesterday as well as today, that the movements had proposed and had done so many things that now I'm not so sure. Are they still wanting what they were formally proposing? It seems and it sounds like they are wanting democracy, but I'm not sure about with the king as head of state under the constitution. And I'm not so sure, are they wanting constitutional monarchy or they just wanting constitution? Because from what they were saying yesterday, especially on the stage, hitting upon the institution, hitting upon the king, I'm not so sure whether I understand the same as Prayuth was just saying and as I used to understand them.
Prayuth, let's ask you then. Do you think the protesters do still want a constitutional monarchy? Because there have been some calls within this disparate protest movements that are wanting to push further than that. Is the monarchy still important to the Thai people?
I think the monarchy is still very important to Thai people. But I think what you need to understand is that yesterday's group in particular is one of a series of groups or one of many groups that have come out to protest. And this group in particular has been one that has probably been, I guess, most advanced in terms of talking about their proposals to reform the monarchy. So I think two things to bear in mind. I think number one is if you look at the content of the 10 proposals that the protesters have submitted on reforming the monarchy, they're still in line with the system of constitutional monarchy. So I think regardless of their kind of true intentions or their true beliefs, at least the concrete proposals that have come out, the content of the proposals do not go beyond what I believe is a system of constitutional monarchy. But I think, as I mentioned, the second point to bear in mind is that yesterday's group is one of many groups that have been campaigning or have been protesting against the government. And if you look at the content of what the other groups have been saying, I think one common line that you see, or one common ground between each group, is a call for constitutional amendment and a drafting of a new constitution that is drafted by the people and is in line with global democratic standards. So I don't think it's fair to kind of paint what the feeling or the sentiments of all groups of protesters are feeling based on just like the content of what was said yesterday. Okay,
so if we take a look at you're part of an organisation that wants a constitutional amendment. What kind of amendments are you looking for? What is the situation that you don't have now that you would like to see in the future?
Sure, I think there are two kind of key issues with this current constitution. One is the origin and the process by which this constitution was drafted and ratified. It was drafted during a period where the military government was in charge, and hence limited participation by the public was involved, in the sense that there were no forums being held to ask what people were thinking or what people wanted to see in the constitution. And when the draft was eventually put to the public via referendum to ratify the constitution, it was a referendum that was, I guess, falls short of democratic standards, in the sense that it was not a free and fair referendum. The side that wanted to reject this version was not allowed to campaign freely. There were charges being made against people who came out in opposition to this draft. So even though it did pass a referendum that was held with a 60% majority score, a lot of people are unhappy with the way that referendum was conducted. So that's one kind of key problem with this constitution, in the sense that people in Thailand don't feel a sense of ownership or feel a sense of participation that they were involved in this drafting process.
Okay.
But the second key issue with the current constitution is actually the content of the constitution as well. Regardless of how it came about, if you look at the articles that are drafted in the constitution, there are several areas where we've seen democratic values decline. I think the most striking one of which is the power and the origin, or the power and the selection process of the 250 senators that currently sit in parliament. They are appointed by the military themselves, and they have the power to even choose who becomes prime minister alongside the 500 elected MPs, which means that you could potentially get a prime minister that does not gather the support of the majority of the people by an election, but then propped up by these 250 military-appointed senators.
Okay, Jade, let me ask you then a couple of quick questions on that. One, is Thailand a democracy? And two, if Thailand is a democracy, why is it that there is such an involvement by the military in the parliamentary process?
Well, I think Thailand is democracy, but let me counter a bit what Prayuth was saying. Okay, what Prayuth was saying, I think about the constitution referendum, that I can agree with, about public participation, about free and fair, and all those things that Prayuth was saying. But I think Prayuth was contradicting himself that when he started about the movements yesterday and today, that it is sort of a solitary of many, many groups, and they were wanting pretty much the same. But when I said that I'm not so sure whether what I used to believe that they were wanting is actually now that what they are really wanting. Prayuth was saying that, well, you know that there are so many groups, and that's only one group who said so on and so forth. So I think this contradictory must be cleared out, that whether or not all the groups are in solitaire, or whether or not all the groups are in discrepancies. Okay, but to answer your question about whether or not Thailand is democracy, of course Thailand is democracy. But if you're asking me why the military got involved in so many public affairs, so many governmental affairs, I think that's a problem of the military. And I think that is something that we have to do away with in this country. Ever since 1932, the military got together with the civilian and took down His Majesty King Raman VII. And ever since, they were trying to fight, trying to attack each other, and trying to steal the power from each other. We have always bad politicians. We have always bad military. And that's why our country is at this point. So if you're asking me whether or not we are democracy, we are democracy. But the politicians as well as the military keep on helping each other, hurting the country over and over. So I think that's our problem. And we have to do away with that. We're not talking about whether or not the monarchy is good or not, whether we have the constitution which is good or not. But we are talking about whether or not we can do away with bad politicians, whether or not we can do away with bad military. And I think that's what we have to do.
Well, my question, my rebuttal then to you, Jade, would be, surely the people should be deciding how to deal with the bad politicians. And in a democratic system, the people decide how to deal with bad politicians by voting them out in elections. The issue in Thailand, you could argue, is that the politicians aren't even getting to the selection points. There was a very popular party, I understand, Popular Future Forward Party, who weren't even allowed to stand. And it wasn't the people making that decision. It was the government and the military making the decision that they couldn't stand.
Well, I think overall, if you look into the constitution, for example, the electoral system was made fairly. The calculation, yes, probably the election commission did not tell how to calculate from the beginning, but the calculation has nothing wrong. And the second thing that Prayuth was raising, yes, I agree, that it's undemocratic to have the senators to help electing the prime minister. But actually in the House, in the lower house, they are already outnumbered if compared to the opposition. Okay, so overall, if you look into the constitution, yes, there are so many undemocratic things, but there are also many democratic issues in there. So are we talking about the sense in which the military is getting involved wrongly? Or are we talking about whether or not politicians are not able to do anything?
Well, I mean, well, let's find out, Parrot. I mean, what would you say the issue is here? Is the issue the military or bad politicians, to quote Jade?
Yeah, let me first clarify, I think, what perhaps Professor Jade misunderstood what I was saying. I think what I was saying is that in Thailand at the moment, there are a lot of group protesters who've been campaigning for various things. I think at the protest yesterday, we even heard issues like same-sex marriage, issues like women's rights being raised as well. Amongst this multitude of issues that have been raised, what I was trying to say is that one common theme that at least binds each group together is a wish for a new constitution to be drafted that is in line with democratic standards. So that's why I was saying that to say that everyone has been protesting about reforms to the monarchy, I think is an unfair representation of the true picture. Although I do admit that there are some proposals that do touch upon reforming the monarchy. What Professor Jade said mathematically may seem correct in the sense that even in the lower house, the government, the prime minister and the governing party at the moment controls more than half of the MPs in the lower house. But I think we cannot judge whether a country is democratic based on what the current situation is like and what the number of MPs in the two houses of parliament are like. But we need to judge it based on the system. And if you look at the rules of the system, we have 750 people who have the power to choose a prime minister. 500 are MPs elected from 38 million people. That gives each person, individual person like me and Professor Jade, a power of 0.00017% in terms of deciding who becomes prime minister. But on the other hand, you have 250 military-appointed senators who were appointed by a committee of 10 people, which means that one of those 10 people actually has a power of 3.3% to elect who becomes prime minister. If you take 3.3% and divide it by 0.00017%, what you get is an answer of 2 million, which means that at the moment, a general member of the population has 2 million fewer power, 2 million less power than a member of the Senate Selection Committee, which, by the way, includes members of the current government. So I think if you ask me whether this country is democratic or not, I think provided if we still have a system whereby you have these 250 senators coming in to elect prime minister, I don't think it's fair to say that Thailand is a full democracy.
The reason I raise the issue of is Thailand a democracy or not is because there have been so many coups d'etats. And after the most recent coup d'etat, when the prime minister took power and became the leader, and he promised elections, and it took years for those elections to come forward, and many have criticised the validity of those elections. And the one constant appears to be the involvement of the military. Let me put it to you, Professor Jade. Do you think it's time for the military to step back from politics and to let the people elect the government they want, even if the government want to elect a party that the military don't like?
Well, I think it has been time long ago that the military should step out of politics.
But they haven't.
Currently,
but they
not
haven't,
only today.
is my point.
But yeah, that's right. But see, I understand and I share the points that Prayuth was raising, that having the senators electing prime minister is totally democratically wrong. Okay, so in that sense, but you see, because the military always stepped in to this action, into the picture of democracy, and they were so impatient, and they thought they were sort of the constitution protector or the national protector or something, which I also share with Prayuth that is something totally wrong. But the problem here that we see not only in this country is that once someone staged a coup, the person who succeeded in staging a coup will take over the sovereign powers of the country. That means that person becomes the sovereign herself. And in this country, in Thailand, I always said over and over that when the military took over the government, they are not only taking over the government, they also took over the king's prerogative. They are pretty much the prerogative, the royal prerogative themselves. They turn themselves into law. And this is true in every country, that if someone staged a coup and it was succeeded, that person took over sovereign powers. So we have to do away with this. And I totally agree that we have to do something with the military. And if the military keeps on doing this, we can never be full-fledged democracy. I share this with Prayuth.
Okay, so what would the solution be? Because we've seen in various protests that have been happening for a number of years in the past, the protests seem to have been divided along the lines of supporting one political leader versus supporting another. These protests do seem very different in that they don't seem to be against different political leaders. They seem to be against the system of governance on the whole, and it does seem to fall down along generational lines. So these seem to be driven to an outsider's perspective. I look at the pictures on the television screens, I see a lot of young people protesting and not the diversity of ages and generations that previous protests have seen. I'd just like to get a perspective from both of you here. Do you think this generational divide represents something of a more fundamental challenge to the way Thailand is run in the future? Prayuth, if I could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think you hit the right point in saying that there are a couple of unique things about this protest. Number one is that the demands are not related to any particular person. They're not trying to oppose a person, or they're not trying to put a person of their own in power, but they want to actually change the system and the game in which this is played. So I think you're right that that's the unique feature of what we're seeing with this protest. I think you're also correct in saying that part of it may be to do with the generational divide. I think the youth of Thailand have grown up in a period where they can access information much more freely via social media. They can access international media sources as well, which make them feel slightly more in line with the rest of the world and just being fed information through local media. So I think it's only natural that they are slightly kind of more aligned with democratic values that they see across the world and liberal democratic values that they see across the world.
Okay,
but when I went to the protest yesterday, I mean, I have to say that I don't think it consisted of just the youth population, but of people across all age groups and across all party lines as well, who want to see a country return to a full democracy. So I guess generational divide may have some part to play, but I don't think it fully explains the picture of what we're seeing here in Thailand.
Okay, Jade, if we take that as read then, do you say, how much of a threat would you say these protests pose to the current political status quo? Do you think this will lead to a change?
Well, I think it's partially true. What Khun Prayuth was raising, that the movement was asking for a reform of the system. And I see that there were many points made about constitutional reform, about whether the military should be involved in politics, about whether we should have the rule of laws and all these other things. Those I see. But the fundamental movement, and I think the bricks and mortars that I have also seen, is that if the attack is directly on the government, bad politicians, on to do away with the military from politics, and constitutional reform, amendments of the constitution, that I will share almost everything with the movement. But the one thing that I disagree sharply, and I feel that might be the main point, that part of the movement yesterday as well as today was really wanting, is to attack directly to the monarchy and directly to His Majesty the King. That I totally and sharply disagree.
Okay.
And that's what I've seen through many of the movements yesterday as well as today. And I disapprove that. If they do away with that, then it should be fine for the movement.
Okay, and just finally, in the final 10 seconds, Prayuth, do you think these calls for reform of the monarchy risk undermining the protest movement?
I think what we have to try and establish first is a right to free speech in Thailand, which means that I do admit that the monarchy is an institution that is respected by a large section of the population in Thailand, including Professor Jade. But I think what we need to establish first as a common ground, as a consensus, is that everyone should have a right to express their opinions in a peaceful way.
Okay, and we'll bring that discussion to a close. Thank you to both our guests, Prayuth Chanocha and Jade Donavanik, and thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting the website aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, head to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hala Mohideen, and the whole team, it's bye for now.